A loaded 9mm sat untouched in the glove box, and an uncashed paycheck waited on the dashboard. The keys were still in the ignition of the truck in the driveway, and the man who owned all of it had walked out of an ordinary house and simply vanished. 3 months later, a man paddling a canoe down the Charles River would find what was left of him. David Cox had already survived the Marine Corps, a court-martial that could have put him away for life, and a Hollywood film that turned the worst night of his career into entertainment. What he didn't survive was a quiet winter morning back home, and more than 30 years later, nobody can tell you who walked him into those woods. David was born in Boston in November 1966 and grew up in Needham, a comfortable suburb. He was the youngest of three, with an older brother, Stephen, and an older sister, Christine. His parents split when he was 15, and he bounced between them before finishing at Needham High School in 1985. He didn't waste time after graduation, and David signed up for the Marine Corps almost immediately, enlisting alongside a close friend through a buddy program that kept them together. They went to Parris Island, the recruit depot in South Carolina, where the Corps takes ordinary teenagers apart and rebuilds them into fighting men. David made it through boot camp, qualified as a scout sniper, and ended up serving in Panama, South Korea, and at Guantanamo Bay on Cuba. By the time he left the service in 1989, he'd reached the rank of corporal and earned an honorable discharge. But it was what happened at Guantanamo that would follow him for the rest of his short life. David's first overseas posting put him on the fence line at Gitmo, guarding the perimeter that separated the American base from Castro's Cuba. He was part of a security team, and by his own account he belonged to an unofficial inner circle the men called the 10. You earned your way in by doing brutal things, running in full gear through 110-degree heat, hanging off a 60-foot tower by your hands until your grip gave out. One Marine in the platoon didn't fit. Private First Class William Alvarado had been writing letters to a Texas congressman. He was complaining about conditions on the base and about Marines firing shots across the line into Cuba. He wanted off the base, and he'd gone around the chain of command to say so, and to the rest of the platoon. That was a betrayal of the highest order. According to the men involved, the order to deal with Alvarado was never written down or said outright. The way David's old squad leader later described it, their platoon commander had implied that if they were good Marines, something ought to happen. So one night in the late summer of 1986, around 1:30 in the morning, several of them went into Alvarado's room. They blindfolded him, gagged him with a pillowcase, bound him with tape, and dragged him from his bunk. The plan, as David told it, was humiliation rather than harm. Shave the man's head and leave it at that. David produced the clippers and got to work, but then everything went wrong, at least to the extent that anything had ever gone right in this situation. Within minutes, Alvarado stopped struggling. He was choking, his lungs filling with fluid, and he was turning a frightening shade of purple. The men cut the assault short and called for help, and Alvarado was rushed to the infirmary, then flown to a hospital in Miami, where he made a full recovery. The Marines who'd held him down were arrested almost at once. What followed was the legal mess that made the case famous. All 10 Marines were handed a choice. They could take a plea deal that carried no criminal conviction, but came with a dishonorable discharge, or they could roll the dice at a court-martial on charges of attempted murder. 7 of them took the deal, but David and 2 others refused, saying that it was, in essence, a hazing gone very wrong. Their defense was that they'd been following an order, even an unspoken one, and that nobody had ever intended for anyone to be seriously injured or worse. It was a hard argument to win, especially with a colonel denying he'd given any such order. David's appointed attorney warned him plainly that Obedience to orders was a defense that had failed at Nuremberg and failed again for the officer behind my lie. David fought it anyway because he believed he'd done nothing wrong, and in the end, the 4-day court-martial cleared him of the serious charges. He was convicted only of simple assault, and since he'd already spent more time than he was ordered to serve in the brig awaiting trial, the sentence amounted to nothing. He went back to finish his enlistment and left the Marines with an honorable discharge, something he never could have managed if he took the deal. For David, this was virtually a complete vindication of his version of events, especially since he had never denied the assault itself, but the intent to end the life of Alvarado. Here's where the story takes its strange turn, and it's probably the reason why you've heard of the case. One of the young Navy lawyers who'd worked the case happened to be the sister of a struggling playwright named Aaron Sorkin, and she told her brother about it. Sorkin turned it into a Broadway play, and in December 1992, that play became a blockbuster film starring Tom Cruise, Jack Nicholson, and Demi Moore. The movie kept the bones of David's real ordeal and changed the details that mattered most. On screen, the hazed Marine died, and the defendants were convicted and drummed out of the Marines. Millions of people watched it, saw that it was based on a real account, and assumed they understood what those men had done, but it wasn't true. David was furious. He felt the film had branded him a hardened criminal and made strangers rich off his name without ever asking. He went on the radio to set the record straight, talking openly about the case and what he'd seen the American military doing in Cuba. Along with several other Marines, he was part of a lawsuit against the studio, seeking $10 million and arguing the story had been lifted from their lives. The suit went nowhere, but by then David had made himself a loud public man with an extreme grievance. Ultimately, though, he accepted that he didn't really have the power to change the Hollywood narrative, either in the court of public opinion or a court of law. By the start of 1994, David was 27 and trying to build a normal life, and he was living with his girlfriend, Elaine Tinsley, in Natick, Massachusetts. He'd earned a 2-year paralegal degree and worked a string of ordinary jobs. At that moment specifically, he was doing temporary work for United Parcel Service, better known as UPS, and hoping it would turn into something permanent. On the night of January 4th, his back was bothering him, so he slept on the couch. The next morning, Tinsley woke him before she left for work around 8:30. He was waiting on a call that would tell him whether he'd gotten the full-time job with UPS. He specifically didn't have any plans to leave the house because he wanted to be around for the call, which he anticipated would be coming that morning. That call came, and when Tinsley phoned home at noon and checked the answering machine, there was a message from David's boss at UPS offering him the position. Now, maybe I'm showing my age here, but I had to confirm that you could call an answering machine to check messages. And yes, this was apparently a routine occurrence. The good news he'd been waiting for had arrived, but David didn't pick up when she called him to tell him that he had missed the call. This was extremely odd because he was supposed to be glued to the phone the whole morning waiting for that specific call. She tried again at 1 o'clock, but there was still nothing. Absolute radio silence. When she got home around 5:30, the house was oddly quiet and every interior door stood open. The rabbit they normally kept in a cage in the kitchen was loose and hopping through the rooms. A few glasses had been knocked over, and David's truck was right where it should be, out in the driveway, but David wasn't anywhere. Then she looked closer at the truck. The keys were in the ignition, and his uncashed paycheck lay on the dashboard. His 9mm was tucked in the glove compartment, right where he'd have reached for it, and he was known to carry it routinely when he went out. A man who'd been trained to fight had left his weapon behind and gone off with someone, with no sign of a struggle to explain it. Tinsley called everyone she could think of, but no one had heard from him. For the time being, she didn't assume the worst, but as the night went on, Her panic ended up reaching a fever pitch. The next day, she filed a missing person report with the Natick police, but the initial searches turned up nothing. The family pleaded through the local media, and for 3 months, there were no leads at all, and the case went cold. On April 2nd, as the spring thaw finally pulled the snow off the ground, a man canoeing down the Charles River near Medfield noticed a shoe poking out from a tangle of branches. When he got closer, he found the remains of David in a wooded patch well off any road. The medical examiner's findings were grim and precise. David had been eliminated execution style, with multiple shots fired. 3 9mm shell casings were recovered at the scene, though the autopsy showed that 4 had been fired. And I find it unusual that only 3 casings were recovered, perhaps suggesting that there was a botched attempt by the assailant to recover them all. That said, I'm no weapons expert, so if you are, feel free to suggest any alternative explanation in the comments. The location also said something too, since the spot sat between 2 hunting ranges, the kind of place where a shot wouldn't make a single neighbor look up. Whoever brought David there knew the ground, and knew the area well enough to commit the crime there. And then there was what he was wearing. Cox had on his military-issue camouflage field jacket and his Marine Corps Scout Sniper hoodie, paired with jeans and white sneakers. His family and the investigators agreed on one odd point. David didn't wear any military-related clothes out in public, and he never had. Robbery was ruled out fast, since cash and credit cards were still in his wallet. Investigators came to believe David had left home willingly with someone he trusted, since there was no forced entry and no sign of a struggle. The walk to the spot where he was found ran the better part of a mile into the trees. Detectives reasoned that a stranger holding a weapon on him would have finished things within the first 40 yards, not marched him deep into the woods. David was, after all, a qualified scout sniper, an elite Marine, and the idea that the attacker would have taken this risk didn't seem right. David, they thought, had walked in beside someone he knew and trusted to a great degree, and that he was, in all likelihood, ambushed. His family split on what that meant, with many members of his immediate family going public with their personal theories. His brother Stephen recalled that David had mentioned spotting a UPS supervisor and a driver in what he believed was theft, months before he vanished. His mother had warned him he was being too loud on the UPS radio about the military, speaking too freely about things he'd been involved in. His sister, Christine, felt that the cold precision of it pointed to a professional job, but she was completely at a loss for who could be responsible. Then there was something that hinted at personal problems in David's life, and it turned out he had developed a gambling habit and owed money at the time of his death. Investigators looked hard at it and didn't buy it, and while they originally thought he may be deeply in debt, that wasn't the case. The debt came to only about $1,000, small enough that he had the funds in the bank to clear it if anyone had leaned on him. The case went cold the moment it began, and no suspect was ever named, nor was any motive ever pinned down. Everyone involved in his life, from his fellow soldiers at Guantanamo, to bookies, to the people at UPS, were investigated, but nothing was ever found. Some Hollywood figures involved in the lawsuit over the movie were also investigated, but they were cleared of all suspicion. In February 2019, 2 members of the Massachusetts State Police announced they were reopening the file. Both were former Marines themselves, and both believed that forensic techniques unavailable in 1994 might finally pull something usable from the evidence. As of now, that's where David's case stands, with no further breakthroughs or any additional developments. Anyway, I'm sure you're all expecting me to have some sort of theory on what actually happened here, but this one doesn't make sense to me at all. My gut feeling is that none of the speculative theories are right, but of course, a gut feeling is just that. One thing I'd like to know, but I can't find an answer to, is if David would wear military related stuff when he was hanging out around buddies from his time in the Marines. If he did, that could possibly point to someone from that period in his life. Perhaps someone who had a bone to pick with David over something that happened over his service. And I'm not even saying that would be something related to the hazing incident. I'm saying any sort of interpersonal conflict over the course of the years. That said, David may have put on his military clothing as a sign to his family and investigators that something was wrong. It may have been his coded way of instantly warning the people who cared about him that he was leaving his house under duress. I can also say for certain I don't believe for a second it was anyone involved in the movie or the lawsuit related to the movie. A Few Good Men was produced by a massive production company and had an astronomical inflation-adjusted budget of about $100 million. These sort of companies get routinely sued, and everyone involved understands that litigation is just one of the costs of doing business. The idea that there was any animus from someone on the winning side of the lawsuit on one of the most financially successful films of the decade strikes me as pure fiction. Anyway, all that said, I have a lot to say about theories I can rule out, but not much in the way of a coherent explanation of the evidence. On a June morning in 2011, a man stood in his own backyard in rural North Carolina with his barbecue tools laid out on the grill. His air conditioner was humming, and his 2 cars and his 2 motorcycles were parked exactly where they always sat. By that afternoon, his house was burning and he was gone, leaving behind no body and no goodbye to anyone who loved him. The only thing that remained was a dog that wandered home alone the next day, and a girlfriend who told his family not to worry, because Daniel had simply gone on vacation. The closest anyone has come to finding him is a single leg, poking out of a car trunk, wearing a sock that looked an awful lot like his, but more on that bizarre sighting in a moment. Daniel Moses was born on the 5th of July, 1951, and as an adult, you couldn't miss him, since he stood 6'3" and weighed in at over 2 bells. By 2011, he was 59, retired after a long career driving trucks, and back home on his family's land in Northampton County after spending most of his adult life up in New Jersey. In his retirement, he liked to fish and hunt, and more than anything, he loved to cook. That last part is what made him a local fixture, and somewhere along the way, Daniel started grilling chicken and bottling barbecue sauce, and it turned out he was very good at it. He built up a steady roster of customers scattered across the county, delivering plates by hand to neighbors who came to know him simply as Dan the Barbecue Man. It was part-time work, but it was the kind he genuinely enjoyed after a career with long hours on the road. He kept in regular touch with his family by phone, and slipping away without a word to anyone would have been completely out of character for him. The last confirmed sighting of Daniel came on the morning of June 16, 2011. He was seen standing behind his home on the 1900 block of W.J. Duke Service Road, out in the Rehoboth community near Rich Square. Later that same day, the small wooden house he lived in caught fire. One of his brothers got the call and rushed over, telling their sister Sheila the home was burning, but that Daniel wasn't inside it. When the fire was finally out, investigators picked through what was left and found something that didn't add up. There was no sign of Dan. Both of his cars and both of his motorcycles sat untouched, and the day after the fire, his dog trotted back to the property alone, with no owner anywhere in sight. Investigators would eventually rule the blaze an accident, blaming faulty wiring in the old building, but Daniel's family has never bought that explanation. For years, the case went cold, with no trace of Daniel. But then in 2022, a witness came forward and told investigators that, around the time Daniel disappeared, she had glimpsed a leg sticking out from the trunk of a car near his house. The foot, she said, was wearing a tennis shoe and the same kind of tube sock Daniel liked to pull on whenever he rode his motorcycle. By her account, a car ahead of her hit a bump near a bridge, and the trunk jolted open just long enough for her to register what was inside before it closed again. Now, I have to question why someone would wait a full 11 years to come forward with that information. I've personally never seen a human leg sticking out of the trunk of a car, but if I did, I would be on the phone with the cops immediately. This witness, on the other hand, decided that despite a man being missing from the neighborhood, she'd simply sit on it for 11 years. In April of 2023, that lead turned into boots on the ground, and dozens of searchers, along with sniffer dogs and drones, converged on the grounds of a former prison near the town of Jackson. Somewhere between 60 and 70 people, drawn from local agencies, North Carolina and Virginia teams, and the surrounding community, turned out to help. They combed roughly 140 acres of trees and fields, ground they believed might be hiding a grave. A detective who was working the case said that the search wasn't just a shot in the dark, but didn't reveal anything more of what happened. Anyway, the fact that the cops searched a very specific spot near those former prison grounds clearly suggests to me that they know much more than has been publicly reported. I also have some serious questions about the witness who waited 11 years to report seeing a leg sticking out of a trunk. I don't imagine there's any situation where someone just sits on that for so long, so I'm guessing there's more to that witness report that hasn't been disclosed. At any rate, I hope there's some justice for Dan in the coming years, and his family can have closure on this unsolved mystery. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy dropping a quick reminder to hit that subscribe button and tap the notification bell. Also, don't forget to check out the Patreon or the membership to take your support for my channel to the next level. Somewhere under a mesa in the far northwest corner of New Mexico, 16 tons of gold may still be lying in the dark, exactly where it was left in the summer of 1933. The man who put it there took care of one thing before he passed, and he never drew a map. When he carried the location into the grave, he turned a fortune into a riddle people have chased for nearly a century. The story begins, as a lot of doomed schemes do, with a few wealthy men in a room convincing each other they'd found a sure thing. In the early days of 1933, in the city of Cuernavaca, 5 wealthy Mexicans sat down to talk about gold. There was Leon Trabuco, a rancher and large-scale miner from Chihuahua, who was rich and hungry for much more. With him were Ricardo Arteaga, a rancher from Torreon, and Carlos Sepulveda, another rancher out of Chihuahua. There was also Rafael Borrega, an international banker with ties to Mexico and Spain, and Guzman Morata, an economics professor at the University of Mexico. Morata was effectively the brains behind the operation, and his pitch was simple and on paper, brilliant. The United States was 4 years deep into the Great Depression. The dollar was wobbling, and he was convinced Washington was about to push up the price of gold. At that point, gold sat at $20.67 an ounce. Morata figured the jump could be $10 an ounce or more, the kind of money that changes a man's life when he's holding tons of the stuff. Buy enough cheap in Mexico, hold it until the American price climbed, and the profit would be staggering. So they pooled their money and started buying as much gold as possible from small-scale miners all across the country. Buying the gold was the easy part, but getting it into the United States without going to prison was where things got interesting. The men took their hoard to a makeshift foundry, melted down coins and jewelry, and recast the whole lot into plain ingots that wouldn't draw as much attention. In under 3 months, they'd accumulated close to 16 tons of solid gold. Smuggling that much metal across the border was a felony that could put all of them behind bars for years, and they knew it. Their solution came from the air. Trabuco is said to have hired a pilot, a man remembered as Red Moiser. It's unclear from the narrative if that name was just an alias given by an American pilot to the wealthy Mexicans, and some researchers believe he was actually called Bill Elliott. Either way, the pilot loaded roughly 1 ton of gold at a time into a small plane and made the run after dark. He reportedly flew 16 evening runs over the following months, changing his route each time so the plane was never once caught crossing the border. The traditional narrative points to a final delivery landing on July 14th, 1933, which will be important, so keep that date roughly in mind. The pilot notably was never told what he was really doing, in the sense that he was never let in on the scheme. He knew he was delivering gold, and he knew it was a smuggling job, but he wasn't wired into the actual operation beyond that. He'd set the plane down on a remote plateau, unload his cargo as fast as possible, and was ordered to take off again immediately. From there, trucks carried the ingots off to a burial site that only Trabuco and whoever was responsible for hauling them off knew. He'd chosen a thinly populated stretch of desert near Farmington in the Four Corners country, close to the Ute and Navajo reservations. It was the kind of empty, sun-scorched ground where a man could bury a fortune and trust that the land would keep it a mystery. Here's where the whole beautiful plan started to come apart, and if you're a fan of American history during this period, you knew what was coming. The men were betting everything on the American government raising the price of gold, but when the government did exactly that, the monkey's paw curled. They just made it impossible for anyone like Trabuco to cash in and profit off their gold hoarding. In April of 1933, while the gold was still being flown north, President Franklin Roosevelt had already signed Executive Order 6102. This made it illegal for private citizens to hoard most gold, with a grace period to surrender what they held to the Federal Reserve for paper money. Then, on January 30th, 1934, came the Gold Reserve Act, and the price of bullion shot upward, and on paper, the group's profit ballooned by something like $7 million. But they couldn't legally sell a single ounce of it inside the country. And worse, they got greedy. Rather than offload the gold for whatever they could get, they decided to sit on it and wait for the price to climb higher. It was the decision that doomed them. 16 tons of treasure had effectively turned into 16 tons of trash they couldn't touch. Perhaps worse than trash, actually, because in general you don't end up getting clapped in cuffs by the feds for having something like that. If you wanted to write the men out of the story one by one, fate seemed determined to do it for you. Over the next several years, every one of Trabuco's partners passed away, under circumstances that are often made out to be mysterious. Personally, I don't see anything too unusual about what happened, but some believe that Trabuco had a hand in knocking off at least some of his associates. Borrega and Murata died from what are generally believed to be natural causes, while Sepulveda lost his life in a car crash. Arteaga went out in a way that's truly bizarre. He was gored in public by a fighting bull. The pilot's end was just as cinematic, and he allegedly perished in a bombing raid over Germany sometime in 1944 or 1945. That left Leon Trabuco. He was now the only living soul who knew where 16 tons of gold lay buried in the New Mexico desert, sitting on a fortune he had no legal way to spend. Now, I will note here that this may be something of a plot hole in the narrative, and there will be more on that shortly. Trabuco had also hired men with trucks to physically haul the gold and bury it, even if those men were kept in the dark about what they were actually moving. The idea that they didn't know it was valuable strikes me as implausible. I've never been in this situation, but if I was meeting someone at a clandestine airstrip near the border and burying something, I would probably assume what I was hauling had some value. For roughly 18 years, Trabuco tried to turn his buried gold back into money, and for roughly 18 years he failed. He worked the black market, reaching out to buyers who wouldn't ask awkward questions about the origins of the gold or why it had been smuggled into the United States. He dealt with men who were reportedly connected to the regimes in Germany and Italy, people who needed large amounts of gold to fund operations in North America. The strangest offer came in 1941 when a man calling himself Ivan Nasiceku approached Trabuco claiming to represent one of the royal houses of Europe. The buyer behind him was suspected to be Karl II, the deposed king of Romania, who was then living in exile in Mexico. The former king had been refused entry into the United States, and the theory goes that he hoped to buy his way across the border with a mountain of gold. Trabuco turned Ivan down flat, judging the whole thing too dangerous, and questioning whether he truly represented any European royalty at all. By 1952, the authorities had caught the scent, and Trabuco, by some accounts, had approached the government himself that year, hoping to quietly cut a deal. Instead of a handshake, he got a grand jury, convened to examine whether he and his partners had plotted to buy up Mexico's gold and dump it in the States for profit. In the end, he was never indicted, and then he slipped out of history altogether. Some accounts have him on his deathbed afterward. Others have him resurfacing in Spain years later, still working the phones, an old man chasing the same gold. Either way, true to form, he left no map behind to indicate where the 16 tons of gold had been left. The one breadcrumb he's said to have dropped near the end was a maddening remark that the gold lay only a few miles from a major New Mexico landmark, which in a state full of mesas and peaks and rivers, narrows it down to almost nothing. But of course, for treasure hunters, any crumb is potentially worth chasing. The legend might have died with Trabuco if not for the treasure hunters, and one in particular gave it most of his life. A man named Ed Foster spent more than 35 years combing the desert around Farmington. He became convinced he'd found the very airstrip Trabuco's pilot used back in 1933, on a plateau called Conger Mesa in San Juan County. Foster reportedly tracked down elderly women on the reservation who remembered a plane landing and taking off there. Of course, the problem with that is that memories fade, and just because planes took off and landed there doesn't mean they were the gold planes. He found other things too that appeared to confirm his suspicions that he was on the right trail. About 20 miles west of the mesa stood an old house that looked like nothing else on the reservation. It was a Mexican-style structure with a front door, a back door, and a veranda, which Foster suspected had been built as a guard post. Not far from it was a rock carved with a date and a phrase that, if real, is hard to argue with. 1933, 16 ton. Foster came to believe the gold lay somewhere inside the triangle marked by those 3 points, in the country near Shiprock Peak. When private ownership of bullion finally became legal again, at the end of 1974, the buried hoard, if it ever existed, was suddenly worth chasing all over again. The desert near Farmington has been walked, surveyed, and dug at by hopefuls for decades, all working from the same thin hand-me-down story and a handful of clues. As of yet, though, no one has found Leon Trabuco's 16 tons of gold, and perhaps they never will, because there's one more element to the lost treasure. The strongest argument against the Trabuco treasure isn't that the story is impossible, it's that it behaves like folklore. Skeptics point out that the legend seems to rest on a very narrow paper trail, and the entire narrative has a very dramatic flair. From Trabuco potentially eliminating other members of the cabal, to Roosevelt banning private gold hoarding as the last shipments were hitting America, it seems a little too perfect. Some skeptics have even gone so far as to say that the entire initial narrative of the smuggling was invented, and that subsequent investigations were based on rumor. Personally, I think it's very possible that elements of the narrative are exaggerated or have grown in the telling, but I don't think that means the whole thing is fake. Treasure stories almost always get polished over time, and it doesn't take much to add in a little extra mystery by claiming Trabucco may have been involved in the deaths of his associates. Though the evidence is quite thin, there's absolutely nothing to suggest that Trabucco was involved in the deaths of his partners in crime. It's something that can simply be inserted into the history by someone who cares more about telling a compelling narrative about a treasure, because the underlying evidence is so thin. Also, timelines get cleaned up over time to make the narrative more dramatic, but again, that doesn't mean the original events didn't happen. Specifically, the idea that the executive order was being signed right during the final gold flights seems like it was possibly added in to add more tension to the narrative. In the end, this is a narrative about rich men getting together to commit what would have been a fairly low-stakes, high-reward financial crime if Roosevelt hadn't changed the laws. To me, that sounds like the exact sort of thing that has happened countless times throughout history. Trabucco's Lost Gold is the classic financial crime narrative about a group of rich men who would risk it all to be just a little more rich. On a clear spring afternoon in 1977, on a Salt Lake City street lined with houses and shops, an 18-year-old left her classroom building and started toward home. Somewhere in those few minutes, in the middle of the day, on a walk that should have taken 10 minutes, she vanished. No one saw a struggle and no one heard so much as a scream. When her remains were found 2 days later, what they found told investigators she'd already been held somewhere else first. Verlaine Briggs had grown up on a cattle ranch outside Dillon, a small town in southwestern Montana. Born in September of 1958, she'd come down to Salt Lake City to study court reporting at the LDS Business College, working toward a steady career taking down testimony in courtrooms. By the spring of 1977, she was 18, sharing an apartment with several other young women, and by every account she was reserved and almost compulsively punctual. The people who knew her would tell investigators the same thing over and over on the day after she disappeared. Verlaine didn't flake out, and she wouldn't have climbed into a car with someone she didn't know. She was also in the middle of a personal upheaval. A few weeks earlier, she'd ended her engagement to a young man who, like her, had come from Dillon. The two had stayed in contact even after the breakup, and the relationship had reportedly frayed over faith. She was a devoted member of the Mormon Church and wanted that life for her future family. Her former fiancé didn't share the same conviction, and according to what he later told police, the two of them had it out one last time on a late-night phone call days before she disappeared. The morning of Thursday, May 5th, started like any other, and Verlaine left the apartment around 9:30 for the short walk to campus. Her class ran until 11:20, and afterward she had plans for the rest of the day. She was supposed to meet a roommate back at the apartment around noon, so the two of them could head to the Crossroads Mall downtown. Several classmates confirmed she made it to the lecture, and one of them even walked down the stairs with her when the class was over. At the bottom of the steps, they said their goodbyes and headed off in different directions. Notably, this witness statement came from just one day after the disappearance, so I consider this absolutely rock-solid eyewitness evidence. That was the last confirmed sighting of Verlaine Briggs, and noon came and went. Her roommate waited, then waited some more. For a young woman this reliable, every passing minute felt a little more wrong, as if something terrible had happened. As the afternoon wore on, the roommates started making calls, first to Verlaine's ex-fiancé, and then long distance to her parents in Montana, who hadn't heard from her either. An uncle who lived locally in Utah filed a missing persons report that night, around 11:15. Now I know you're expecting the cops to have done nothing here, but by the standards of 1977, what happened next was actually fairly diligent. Within a day, Salt Lake City police had put out a bulletin to neighboring agencies confirmed she'd attended her class, and started working the phones. They contacted hospitals, cab companies, and bus lines, hoping someone had seen her. They went door to door through her neighborhood with her photograph, but every avenue came up empty. When her parents drove down from Montana, they sat with detectives and laid out the kind of portrait that would shape the whole investigation. Their daughter, they insisted, would never have climbed into a vehicle by force or out of fear without putting up a tremendous fight. She was athletic and she wasn't easily intimidated, and she wouldn't have hitchhiked or gone off with a stranger on a whim. The tragic answer to the first part of the mystery, where Valane was, came on the evening of May 7th. Up in Lambs Canyon, in the mountains east of the city, a group of teenage boys out exploring stumbled onto something. It was the body of a young woman at the bottom of a steep slope near a stream. They ran, argued among themselves about whether they'd be blamed, and finally decided they had to tell someone. A detective drove the boys back up the canyon, and they led him straight to where Valane had been dumped. What investigators found was disturbing in its detail. Her wrists had been bound together with a woman's stocking, her ankles the same way. Then all four had been cinched together with a black belt patterned with flowers. There was a thin ligature line running from behind both ears, across the front of her throat, fainter toward the back of the neck, the kind of mark left when a cord is pulled from behind. She had patterns of bruising that indicated that she must have put up a substantial fight against the attacker. Detectives determined that she'd likely been restrained somewhere else before being brought to that location. Her belongings were scattered as far as 30 feet away. Jeans, a blouse, a jacket, undergarments, shoes, a notepad, some keys, and textbooks. From the careless way it was all strewn down the hillside, it looked as though someone had simply pitched it over the edge from the road above. The autopsy was performed on May 8th, and the medical examiner ruled the cause was ligature strangulation, likely from a cord or rope. Notably, while detectives initially thought she'd been subjected to a further form of assault, the evidence on the autopsy came back inconclusive. However, what they were able to pull from her body was hair, presumably from the attacker. Soon the cops looked to every man in her orbit, and 3 names rose to the surface. The first was an elderly man, around 65, who lived in Valane's building and made the young women there deeply uncomfortable, leering and calling out to them as they passed. He had no alibi for May 5th, claiming he'd been home alone all day, and he carried a long criminal record that included the worst offenses imaginable. When detectives searched his camper, they found rope, potentially the same kind that was used for the ligature. When they searched his apartment, they found women's underwear in the trash. He sat for a polygraph, passed it, and handed over hair samples that didn't match what was found at the scene. With the forensic tools of the 1970s, that was as far as he could be pushed at that moment. Now I will say, for these hair samples, we don't have any great detail on them, or why they were specifically believed to be from the attacker. It's possible that the samples didn't come from the assailant, despite what the detectives thought, which complicates matters. That said, since it's an open investigation, I'm of course working with an incomplete evidentiary record. The second was a young instructor at the college, only 24, who worked as a court reporter by day and taught in the evenings. He'd taken a noticeable interest in her, dropping by the ice cream shop where she worked part-time and phoning her at home more than once, behavior her classmates noticed and found odd. He was also married and had a family, presenting himself as an upright family man. He admitted he and Valane had talked about her on-again, off-again engagement, but insisted their relationship never went past teacher and student. He had a reasonable alibi at his day job, and detectives largely took it at face value, but they never searched his home or asked him to take a polygraph. The third was her ex-fiancé, and his behavior was originally read as somewhat unusual by detectives. He'd gone out searching the canyons with his father almost immediately, and when asked why, he had a potentially concerning answer. He reportedly said that if anything had happened to her, she'd probably end up in a canyon, a grim leap to make while everyone else still clung to the hope that she was alive. However, as it turned out, him and his father had simply been looking absolutely everywhere. Further, the police seemed to treat this as some sort of uncanny prediction, since she was ultimately recovered from that canyon dump site. Now, personally, I don't think it takes Sherlock Holmes to figure out that a criminal might take an endangered person's remains to a desolate area, but hey, that's just me. He also had an alibi, since he'd been working a shift as a cook at a hotel that day, at the time she disappeared, and his supervisor and numerous others backed him up. He declined a polygraph, though it remains unclear to me if that was on a lawyer's advice or not. His declining the polygraph meant that detectives at the time weren't willing to immediately rule him out, despite his alibi. And of course, polygraphs aren't accurate whatsoever, and even if you're not guilty, there's plenty of reasons to not want to take one. For instance, if he had failed the polygraph test due to anxiety, but was innocent, taking that test could have potentially halted a proper investigation. Polygraphs are an absolute meme of an investigative tool, and they really only work on people who think they're actually lie detectors. The ex-fiancé was eventually ruled out as a potential suspect, and cold case detectives have recently reaffirmed they don't believe he was involved whatsoever. Honestly, seems fairly obvious to me that he couldn't have been in two places at once, and this is another case of detectives getting caught up on a polygraph refusal. In June, the sheriff's office shipped some 20 pieces of evidence to the FBI crime lab in Washington. Examiners lifted dozens of latent fingerprints and several palm prints from items near the body, but this was long before national fingerprint databases existed. Unfortunately, at some point afterward, this evidence was lost, and detectives have spent years asking the FBI to track them down. But so far, no one has. A month later, the case briefly flared back to life when a teenage hitchhiker turned up in Montana carrying identification with Verlaine's name on it. For a moment it seemed like a break, but it turned out it wasn't. It was a forgery, bought from a man in Salt Lake City who made fakes, and the name had simply been lifted from Verlaine's published obituary. The forger had the habit of picking the names of deceased individuals to lower the risk that anyone would notice what he was up to. The case sat cold for decades, and then, in the 2010s, the science finally started to catch up. Newer testing of the old evidence produced DNA, but not the clean answer everyone wanted. What came back was a mix of two or more unknown male profiles tangled together. This was complicated by the very real chance that investigators in 1977 had been sloppy and contaminated the evidence. Two of the original persons of interest, the elderly neighbor and the young instructor, have since been partially excluded through that genetic evidence. And I say partially excluded here, because it remains unclear if either one or both of these samples are simply the result of sloppy handling of the evidence. Perhaps more importantly, both men are now deceased, so if they were involved, they're beyond the reach of American justice. As for the ex-fiancé who was once a suspect, despite the fact that they were broken up at the time, he continues to seek justice for Verlaine. Cold case detectives currently believe Verlaine got into a car that afternoon, willingly, with someone she knew well enough to trust. Personally, I think this rules out the creepy elderly neighbor, since I doubt she would have got into a vehicle willingly with him. Ultimately, though, it appears that her entire social circle was never really fully investigated at the time. She likely had dozens of social connections at university, from other students to teachers, and she was also a devout member of the Mormon Church. She also worked part-time. bringing her in contact with even more people who she may have trusted. But all that said, I have a theory on this one, and I tend to think that the person responsible for the attack wasn't actually anyone close to her. My reason for this comes from a distinct bit of evidence: the dump site used by the criminal. Salt Lake City in the 1970s was surrounded by a ton of wilderness and desolate areas, places that could hide a body for years. We know that Verlaine wasn't taken to the site where she was found right away, that she was dumped there later. That means that this likely wasn't just a haphazard choice of a location, but rather, some thought must have gone into it. Anyone who was local would have known the site where she was ultimately dumped off wasn't actually a great place to hide the body. However, to someone from out of state, it may have looked like the middle of nowhere. This is circumstantial, of course, but I think this piece of evidence distinctly points away from any of the established suspects. This brings me to my final point on the case, because I think there's a very good chance that it gets solved in the near future. If the genetic evidence that was found isn't contaminated, this seems like an obvious case where genetic genealogy could lead to a significant breakthrough in the near future. For about 5 hours on a cold afternoon in 1989, a young man stood inside a suburban pizza shop with a loaded revolver, 2 terrified employees, and a grievance that made no sense. He fired rounds into the ceiling and he demanded a fortune and a getaway car, but in the end, he wasn't there for the money. He was there because of a bizarre character wearing a rabbit suit, a mascot used to sell a certain pizza chain's marinara manhole covers. The man's name was Kenneth Noyd, and the mascot on television that winter, the one Domino's kept telling everyone to avoid, was also called the Noyd. As far as Ken was concerned, that wasn't a coincidence. It was a message aimed straight at him. Here, the unsolved mystery isn't directly about the crime itself, but what happened afterwards. In the mid-1980s, Domino's was locked in a delivery battle with the sit-down chains like Pizza Hut. The fear it had to fight was a specific one. Plenty of customers assumed that a delivered pizza was a cold pizza. The company needed to put a face on that worry so it could promise to beat it. Its whole pitch was speed, a hot pizza at your door in 30 minutes or less, and it needed a way to dramatize everything that could go wrong on the trip there. So an advertising agency dreamed up a villain who really wanted you not to have a hot and fresh pizza. The name itself was a play on the word annoyed, which was more or less the entire point of the campaign. What they built was genuinely bizarre. The Noid was a buck-toothed, pot-bellied figure stuffed into a skin-tight red bunny costume, and his entire purpose in life was to wreck your dinner. He'd freeze pizzas, smash them, and pogo across the boxes, doing whatever it took to make sure your order showed up cold and ruined. The studio that animated him in clay was the same one behind the dancing California raisins. The thing caught fire. The Noid landed on t-shirts and lunch boxes, and even headlined in his own video game, though to be fair, it was just a reskin of a Japanese game about a ninja. For a few years in the late 80s, "Avoid the Noid" was the kind of slogan that everyone knew, and it all seemed like harmless fun. Enter Kenny Noid, who was 22 and living in the Atlanta area. By the accounts of the people who knew him, he'd struggled with mental health for some time, and the commercials had gotten under his skin in a way his family found hard to explain. He didn't see a weird, annoying marketing gimmick. He saw himself in the bizarre mascot, that he inspired it, and that he was to be avoided, like the Noid. Somewhere in his thinking, the cartoon stopped being a coincidence of names and became proof that the Domino's founder had it out for him personally. He decided the company had stolen his name and built an entire marketing empire just to humiliate him in front of the whole country. It got darker than that, though, and this is the part that makes it extremely clear that Ken was very much unwell. He had become convinced that someone connected to the pizza chain was getting into his apartment when he wasn't home, letting themselves in and sniffing around. Kenny believed that these people were looking for clues from his life because they couldn't figure out the next direction the character should take. Sometimes he described it as the founder of Domino's himself doing the snooping, while other times it was his agents. Perhaps most bizarrely, he confided to his family members that he had suspicions that it was the Noid itself rooting through his apartment. And no, you don't have to rewind there. Ken's mind state was so fractured at the time that he literally believed the founder of the pizza chain was sending a cartoon character to investigate him. I had to check the timeline on this, but this was just a year after Who Framed Roger Rabbit was a massive success. I have to wonder if some of Ken's mental framework could be explained by him misinterpreting the movie for a realistic depiction of real life while he was in a delusional state. A relative would say afterward that the family knew the campaign bothered him, but nobody imagined it would ever come to anything like what it did. In his mind, this wasn't a one-sided obsession at all. It was a feud playing out in front of America, and he was convinced he was losing it. On the morning of January 30th, 1989, he decided to even the score in a way that could only make sense under a delusional framework. It was around midday when Kenneth walked up to a Domino's in Chamblee, a suburb northeast of Atlanta, carrying a Magnum. He'd timed it, knowingly or not, for the slow stretch before the dinner rush, when the store was nearly empty and there was no crowd to get in the way. He was a tall man, well over 6 feet, and the employee who had opened the shop that day later recalled how fast the situation tipped from confusing to deadly. Kenny explained, calmly enough at first, that Domino's owed him money for the Noid and that he wanted the founder on the phone. So the employee did the only thing he could think of at the time. He dialed the one corporate number he was sure somebody would actually answer, a safety hotline, and tried to convince the woman who picked up that this was really happening. Unfortunately, the woman on the other end thought it was a prank, perhaps something being recorded for a weird marketing stunt. The whole marketing campaign revolved around the Noid doing bizarre and inexplicable things, so getting a reaction out of corporate wasn't entirely out of line. Then Kenneth pulled the trigger and put a couple of rounds into the ceiling, and her tone changed in an instant. He shouted, loud enough to be heard down the line, that he'd harm the employees if police showed up. Then he hung up the phone, and every line in the restaurant started ringing at once. What followed stretched across the entire afternoon as the police laid siege to the normally peaceful pizza parlor. When officers did arrive, Kenneth fired several more warning shots into the ceiling, but the police didn't fire back. On the phone, a negotiator tried to talk him into letting the 2 employees go, and Kenneth swung between sounding perfectly reasonable and making no sense at all. One moment he was bargaining like a man who'd thought it through and wanted the campaign ended. The next he was talking about large sums of cash, wanting a private plane to fly him to Mexico, or just wanting to go home. It became clear to the cops who were negotiating with him that this wasn't your usual hostage situation. To the officers trying to read him, he was close to impossible to predict, friendly one minute and menacing the next, and there was no telling which version of him would pick up the phone. His demands had a logic that only worked inside his own head, and they were constantly changing. He wanted $100,000 as compensation for his likeness being used for the Noid, and he acted as if he was really bargaining with corporate about this. Other times he wanted a white limousine to drive away to a waiting jet, or perhaps to just drive him home, depending on the moment. Sometimes he wanted the employees to call the company's headquarters up in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and make them stop the Noid campaign. And then there was the book. At one point, Kenneth offered to release one of the hostages in exchange for a copy of a science fiction novel called The Widow's Son. It's a wildly obscure request, the kind of detail you couldn't invent. The novel was part of a cult series built around secret societies threaded through history, a strange thing for a man in his state to fixate on mid-standoff. But when an officer actually tracked down a copy and brought it to the store, Noyd reconsidered and said that the exchange was called off. Why he requested this specific book remains a mystery, though if I had to speculate, I would guess that he believed he was somehow a key player in world affairs. Back in Michigan, the company's executives were coming apart. There wasn't much that anyone hundreds of miles away could do except wait for the next phone update and hope the two young workers made it home. Inside the store, the pizza maker who initially talked to Ken tried a different tactic. He decided the smart move was to keep Kenneth calm, even sympathetic, so he talked to him like a person instead of a captor. At some point, Kenneth got hungry and asked for a loaded pizza, 4 kinds of meat with a pile of vegetables and extra cheese. The employee made it, but Kenneth was paranoid enough that he wouldn't let the man come near it with a pizza cutter, apparently afraid the blade might end up turned on him. Well, I suppose that may not have been paranoid in the circumstances, since you probably don't want to mess with someone in fight or flight mode. The break came the way these things sometimes do, through an ordinary moment that turned into a window. Late in the afternoon, Kenneth agreed to let a single officer come inside to talk to him face to face. He needed somebody to open the door, and he chose the pizza maker to do it. For a few seconds, the young man stood there, close enough that Kenneth could easily have cut him down, and made his decision. He grabbed the handle, shoved the door open, and ran away as fast as he could before Ken could react. The second employee saw the opening and took it too, slipping out while Kenneth's attention was turned. Both of them made it, and around 5 o'clock that evening, with his hostages gone and his options spent, Kenneth Noyd gave himself up. No one had been hurt in the ordeal, at least not physically, a fact that would be of great assistance to Noyd going forward. Kenneth was charged with kidnapping, aggravated assault, and extortion, and on paper it looked like a slam dunk. The question was never really what he'd done, since there were 2 witnesses who had been there from the beginning, and an entire team of cops too. The answer was the thing his family had been gesturing at all along, that Ken was a sick man, not an evil man. He was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, and a judge ultimately found him not guilty by reason of insanity. The verdict didn't mean he simply walked free. It meant the court accepted that, in the moment he was committing the crimes, he genuinely couldn't understand reality. Instead of prison, he was sent into lockdown psychiatric custody, where he spent months in treatment for the illness that had convinced him a clay cartoon was a living enemy. Sadly, though, the delusion never loosened its grip on Ken, even after the standoff, the charges, and the diagnosis. Kenneth couldn't shake the belief that Domino's had built the Noyd to mock him. He was eventually released from psychiatric custody, and unfortunately, this wasn't to be his second chance at a normal life. In 1995, some 6 years after the afternoon that briefly made him national news, he closed the curtains on himself at his home in Tallahassee, Florida. For Domino's, the timing of all this was a nightmare, because the standoff happened while the Noyd was at the absolute peak of his fame. The headlines almost wrote themselves, and the papers couldn't resist the obvious line that this time the hostages hadn't managed to avoid the Noyd. The company kept using the character for a while afterward, but within a few years, as the 80s novelty wore thin and the 30-minute guarantee itself ran into trouble, the man in the red suit quietly disappeared from the marketing. The company has always insisted the hostage situation had nothing to do with that decision, and maybe that's the honest truth. Personally, though, I suspect that this was the reason the character was ultimately pulled from circulation, but admitting it could simply create copycats. Domino's, by insisting that the hostage incident had nothing to do with the pulling of the character, disincentivized others from acting in the same way. Of course, for Kenneth, I don't believe that would have made much of a difference at all, because he wasn't working within a rational framework when he committed the crime. Hey friends, it's Jimmy here, with my usual reminder to hit the notification bell and turn on all those notifications. Also, don't forget to suggest topics in the comments. Anything from true crime cases to bizarre unsolved mysteries you'd like to see covered. I've got a long list of topics to cover, but even so, I wouldn't mind adding a few more to the list. At around 2 o'clock in the morning on Monday, the 11th of June, 1951, someone leaned a collapsible ladder against the wall of the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich. The window he was aiming for sat about 11 feet above the ground, well inside the line of steel grills meant to protect the Nelson galleries. He went up, slipped through, climbed down into the gallery on the same ladder, and helped himself to the most treasured object in the building. Then he went back out the way he'd come, and by the time anyone realized what had happened, he was gone. The alarm went up immediately. Scotland Yard was called, and the police were on the premises within 4 minutes, but they were still too late. What he took wasn't a painting or a chest of gold. It was a spray of diamonds about 7 inches by 4, shaped like a starburst. It carried a story that stretched back more than a century and a half, to one of the most famous sea battles in British history. We have to go back in time to fully understand what happened, all the way to the summer of 1798. Napoleon Bonaparte had landed an army in Egypt, which was nominally Ottoman territory, and the Sultan in Constantinople wasn't pleased about it. On the 1st and 2nd of August, a British fleet under a one-armed rear admiral named Horatio Nelson found the French fleet anchored in Aboukir Bay, near the mouth of the Nile. Admiral Nelson's actions effectively annihilated the French fleet, striking a major blow to the French position in the Mediterranean and beyond. Nelson himself had been wounded in the head during the action that day, briefly convinced the deep gash would at the very least end his naval career. The French flagship, a giant called L'Orient, caught fire and blew apart in an explosion so violent that the fighting reportedly paused while both sides watched. Hundreds of French sailors perished when she went up, and their commanding admiral had already fallen earlier in the fighting. Napoleon's army was left stranded in Egypt with no way home. It was a catastrophe for France and a gift to the Ottoman Empire. Sultan Selim III wanted to thank the man responsible, and he didn't do things by half measures, so he had his royal jewelers create something to commemorate Nelson's victory. He awarded Nelson a chelenk, an Ottoman military honor that had begun life centuries earlier as a simple feather pinned to a turban to mark a warrior's bravery. By the late 18th century, it had become a jeweled ornament, and Nelson's was the first ever given to someone who wasn't Ottoman. A normal chelenk had 7 rays, but Nelson's was made with 13, one for each enemy ship his fleet had taken, burnt, or sunk at the Nile. A letter written at the time, later printed in a naval journal, described it about as well as anyone could. The writer said it looked like a hand with 13 diamond fingers reaching out. At its center sat a large diamond ringed by 4 more, each of those 5 worth perhaps 1,000 pounds on its own, with around 300 smaller stones set around them. Here's the detail that turned a brooch into a marvel. The central star was mounted on a tiny clockwork mechanism, so that when Nelson wore it, it rotated and flashed in the light. The whole thing, along with an Ottoman robe of honor, was handed to him at Naples in December 1798. Nelson wore it on his hat like a turban jewel, but worn in the British style, and people lost their minds over it. It set off a fashion craze in England for similar ornaments, and it became so closely tied to him that artists kept painting it onto his hat in portrait after portrait, long after the fact. They called it the Plume of Triumph, and for a man who was never shy about glory, it was the perfect accessory. And yes, if you ever wondered what that bizarre ornament was on Admiral Nelson's hat, now you know it was a Turkish honor. After Nelson fell at Trafalgar in 1805, the chelenk passed to his family, who held it for generations, and it was even worn at the court of Queen Victoria. Then, in 1895, it was sold at auction, and it drifted through private hands until 1929, when a public appeal was raised to keep it in the country. It was given to the nation in memory of Sir Colville Berkeley, a recently deceased British ambassador to Portugal. When the National Maritime Museum opened its doors at Greenwich in 1937, the Chelenk went on display as one of its star exhibits. There it sat for the next 14 years, glittering behind glass, until the man with the ladder arrived. The theft caused enough of an uproar that it was raised in the House of Lords, and the First Lord of the Admiralty stood up and laid out what was known. The jewel had been taken in a carefully planned smash and grab, and it appeared to be the only target of the robbery. The reward offered for its return was a modest £250, which, as it turned out, wasn't that unreasonable, given how the diamonds had declined in value. As precious as the Chelenk was to the nation, the diamonds themselves weren't actually worth a fortune. They were rose-cut stones, not the finest quality, and by modern standards, they weren't especially well cut. While these diamonds were worth a fortune back in Nelson's time, that was clearly no longer the case by the 1950s. Its worth was sentimental, historical, and essentially priceless in the way that only an irreplaceable thing can be, while being worth comparatively little to a fence. After all, this was one of the most distinctive pieces of jewelry imaginable, and it was simply too hot to resell without breaking the piece apart. There was a sharp observation in the debate in the House of Lords. More than one peer pointed out that this wasn't the first national relic to vanish recently. Treasures belonging to the Duke of Wellington had gone missing from another museum not long before. One of the lords wondered aloud whether somebody had started specializing in stealing relics of national importance to Britain. The man on the ladder was almost certainly George Chatham, a Fulham-born burglar known across London's underworld as Taters. This was a nickname borrowed from Cockney slang for cold, for how calm he stayed on a job no matter what the pressure was. Chatham had once dreamed of being a footballer, and even had a trial for a professional team. But by the 1930s, he'd settled into a far more lucrative trade, picking his victims out of society magazines and slipping through the London smog. And he had history with exactly this kind of target. In 1948, he'd allegedly climbed a pair of ladders lashed together to reach a window 40 feet up at the Victoria and Albert Museum. He made off with 2 jeweled ceremonial swords that had belonged to the Duke of Wellington. They were never recovered, and he was never charged, but chatter in the underworld was clear that it was he who had done it. So when that lord wondered aloud about a connoisseur of stolen relics, he was unknowingly describing a real man, and that man had simply moved on from Wellington to Nelson. What happened to the Chelenk afterwards is the saddest part of this heist. Usually when I cover unsolved mysteries surrounding these sorts of heists, there's a good assumption that the item is still around somewhere out there. That likely isn't the case here, and the Chelenk is unlikely to ever be recovered, due to a little biographical fact about the thief himself. Chatham was a compulsive gambler who fed most of his loot straight into the rigged casino tables of London's gangsters. By the time he died penniless in 1997, he'd reportedly stolen close to £100 million worth of goods over his career. If that number seems absolutely insane, it is, but it makes more sense when you realize he spent over 60 years as a professional thief, targeting high society individuals. In a feat that would be impressive if he wasn't a criminal, he was still performing acts of cat burglary into his 80s. By his own later account, he sold Nelson's jewel for the modern equivalent of a few £1,000s to a criminal gang, who he believed broke it apart into individual stones. To put that in some perspective, he essentially destroyed a priceless piece of history for the equivalent of $5,000. Those rose diamonds, never the best to begin with, would have been scattered and reset, untraceable within weeks. They may also have been recut, which would have made the identification of the stolen goods even more difficult. The shell-ink that had survived the death of a national hero and 150 years of history was very probably destroyed within days of being stolen to settle a gambling debt. It's never been seen again, and if I had to take an educated guess, it never will be. A priceless piece of national heritage lost forever. On the night of July 4th, 1982, an 18-year-old girl drove out to deliver 3 pizzas to a house that never existed. It was on a road where there was no such number, and somewhere out there in the dark, she stepped out of her car and simply vanished. When people found the vehicle a short while later, the engine was still running and the pizzas were on the ground. Her case would be solved in large part, but at least one mystery still remains before this case can ever truly be considered closed. Sherry Irely had only just started building the early scaffolding of an adult life. She'd been born in December 1963, and by the summer of 1982, she'd graduated from Sprague High School in Salem, Oregon. She moved into an apartment in the south end of the city with her cousin. To make a bit of money, she'd taken a part-time job delivering pizzas for the local Domino's. It's the sort of work plenty of new graduates fall into for a season or two before figuring out what comes next. July 4th was, of course, a holiday, but the pizza business doesn't take holidays, and Sherry wasn't even supposed to be on the schedule, but she got called in. Because she said yes to working that night, she was the one standing behind the counter when a particular order came through that evening. The call came from a man, and he gave his name as Dunbar, presumably a last name. During the conversation, he could reportedly be heard talking to someone else in the room, sorting out what they wanted. What they wanted in the end was a destroyer, the shop's everything on it pie. 3 of them, in fact. He gave an address out on Riverhaven Drive, in a remote stretch of Salem down near Brown Island Road and the Willamette River. It wasn't the sort of place that saw a lot of late-night traffic, and there was one more thing the caller mentioned, almost in passing. He said they'd gotten pizza before from a particular female driver, a young woman who drove an orange Volkswagen, and that she'd know exactly where the place was. It sounded like a harmless request, but really, it wasn't. That driver, the one he asked about by description, wasn't working that night. At any rate, it appeared that the caller wanted a woman to come to this desolate address, and he wanted one that was known to come alone. For reasons that aren't quite clear to me, despite this unusual request, Sherry was the one who was sent alone on the delivery run. She gathered up the 3 large boxes and left the store at around 9:30 to find an address that was never going to be there. Now, personally, I've never worked at a pizza place, but if you have, I'd definitely like your input on this request. It seems to me that any request for a female pizza delivery driver should be an automatic red flag, a big glaring sign that something might be wrong with this request. Or maybe I've just been researching and writing about true crime cases for too long, and it's made me overly cautious. Anyway, let me know in the comments. Sometime that evening, out on that quiet road, Sherry's delivery car was found abandoned. The accounts differ a little on who exactly stumbled across it first, but the picture they paint is consistent and chilling. The motor was idling, a door hung open, the 3 large pizza boxes were lying on the ground outside the vehicle, and in the car, her dog was still waiting. The scene told its own story. One of the pizza boxes on the ground had a tire track pressed across it, while another had the print of a boot. There was no blood and no broken glass, nothing of the loud chaos you might expect from a struggle. To investigators, it didn't read like a young woman who'd wandered off trying to find an address. It looked like a planned abduction that had taken only seconds. When police followed the obvious thread and went looking for the address she'd been sent to, they confirmed what the empty car already suggested. The location was fictitious, the name Dunbar was fake, and when they traced the number the order had come from, it led back to a motel in Salem. The whole errand had been an invention from the first ring of the phone, and it appeared to be concocted to kidnap the woman who was supposed to be working that night. The day after Sherry disappeared, the phone rang again at the Domino's where she worked. This time the caller demanded money, $50,000 specifically, for her safe return. For her family, that call must have carried a terrible flicker of hope, since a ransom demand at least implied she was alive. That hope went nowhere, and whoever placed the call never followed up in any way. It remains unclear if that call was a sick prank, or if it actually came from the man who went by Dunbar, or perhaps one of his associates. However, there's strong evidence to suggest it was the latter, but I'll get back to that in a moment. Meanwhile, search parties combed the area around the abandoned car in the days that followed. Police turned up several witnesses who recalled seeing a suspicious older model pickup parked along the roadside around the time Sherry vanished. It was a four-wheel drive truck riding on large tires, with a pair of spotlights mounted up on the cab. It had been positioned oddly, front end off the road and the back facing the pavement, almost as if it were waiting. Nobody could say who it belonged to, and the truck, like Sherry, seemed to evaporate. For a long stretch, the investigation circled one name. Darrell J. Wilson drove a lime green pickup, similar to the kind of vehicle witnesses had described near the scene. Then word reached police that Wilson had repainted that truck brown not long after Sherry went missing, a detail that has a way of getting an investigator's attention. He'd reportedly known Sherry, along with another young woman who'd disappeared from the Salem area around that same period. And I'm just going to give it away here, because the coincidences are about to get very weird. This is a good lesson in why strong circumstantial evidence doesn't always add up, and why investigations shouldn't just be stopped when what is about to happen here happens. Wilson wasn't involved in any way, but absolutely every action he took implied he was definitely involved. When detectives questioned him, Wilson first claimed he didn't know Sherry at all, then changed his story and admitted he'd met her at a party. He told them he'd been camping with friends at a lake east of the city the night she vanished, but the trouble was the timeline. There was a window of several hours that he couldn't account for, and Sherry's abduction fell squarely inside it. A month after Sherry disappeared, in August 1982, police questioned Wilson again. Just hours later, Wilson decided to pull the curtains on himself, leaving behind no note or anything that might break the case. For years afterward, plenty of people connected to the case were convinced he'd been involved somehow, and it's plain to see why. The timing of his actions obviously suggested guilt, but cold case detectives looking at the file later came to a markedly different conclusion. Wilson never had any real criminal history beyond substance troubles, and there was no suggestion that he was a violent individual. He was, however, extremely paranoid, potentially due to his issues with drugs, and that could explain his actions. Wilson, they decided, didn't fit, and cold case investigators began to suspect that the man who took Sherry had done something like this before and would do it again. But the fact remained that at that time, after Wilson did what he did, the investigation was, for the time being, essentially closed. The case sat unsolved for decades, profiled on national television, kept alive by a family that refused to let it fade. The answer, it turned out, had been sitting in an Oregon prison the whole time, at least to a certain extent. His name was William Scott Smith, an unemployed truck driver from the area, and as it turns out, a prolific serial predator. In 1984, 2 years after Sherry vanished, Smith abducted and killed 2 young Salem women, who fit the same victim profile as Sherry. He was caught, he confessed, and he was handed 2 life sentences, but those crimes were only the half of what he had done. He'd been questioned about Sherry early on and had brushed it off, insisting he'd been driving a truck up in Washington at the time. That alibi eventually fell apart, and investigators later found that Smith had been stopped and questioned by police near Salem within hours of Sherry's abduction. This put him exactly where he claimed not to have been at the time of the attack. Cellmates told authorities he'd talked about being mixed up in something involving a, quote, pizza girl, and some of those statements ended up recorded on tape. Usually I'm wary of anything that comes from a jailhouse snitch, for obvious reasons, but I have to respect the commitment to smuggling in a recording device, especially in that era. When detectives finally sat back down with Smith in 2006 and offered him a transfer to a different prison in exchange for cooperation, he started singing like a canary. What he told them lined up with the physical evidence, and it included things that had never been made public. He knew the pizzas that had been ordered had been called destroyers, something that wasn't known to the public at the time. Since the staff of the Domino's knew what was ordered, this didn't inherently mean he knew something that no one could have known, but it wasn't publicly reported. He also knew about the $50,000 ransom call, which again, wasn't something that was reported. Again, this wasn't something that necessarily couldn't have leaked out, but this was 2 for 2 on key pieces of evidence not released to the public. He claimed that his accomplice, a man named Roger Nosef, had made the ransom call the day after. Then came the thing that made it absolutely clear that Smith wasn't bluffing for a move to a comfier prison. He explained that the 2 of them had meant to grab a different driver, a young woman with the orange Volkswagen. The plan was to hold her for ransom, but she hadn't been working, so they'd taken her replacement instead. They'd flagged Sherry down, dragged her into their truck, driven her to a spot near Smith's parents' home, and there, he'd ended her life. He didn't indicate what was done to her in detail, or why the plan changed from an abduction for ransom into something so much darker. He said he put her body in the Pudding River, the same water where he'd disposed of his other victims. He ended up taking the cops out to the location, but unfortunately, there would be no closure for Sherry's family, at least not yet. Repeated flooding over the years had scattered whatever might have been recovered. On December 18, 2007, William Smith pleaded guilty to Sherry Irely's slaying and accepted another life sentence to stack atop the ones he was already serving. Nosef, for his part, succumbed to cancer a few years earlier and was, of course, never charged. Years later, Smith would confess to another slaying that dated back to 1981, closing yet another old wound in Salem and bringing his victim count to 4. Given the fact that Smith worked as a trucker and had, by some accounts, traveled all around the West Coast, the true extent of his crimes likely isn't yet fully known. Ultimately, for me, it's hard to consider this case fully resolved given that Sherry's body was never recovered. It also struck me while I was researching this case that this fact pattern isn't something that could have happened today, at least not exactly. These days, if you were to place a pizza order to a non-existent location in a dangerous area, I'm sure it would be immediately flagged and no delivery person would go there. Back in 1982, you could apparently request a female driver to specifically come to your creepy location in the middle of nowhere to a fake address. Another question I have about this case is ultimately whether there's any truth to the ransom plan to begin with. The whole concept of it simply doesn't make any sense to me at all, because it relied upon kidnapping a young pizza delivery driver. Now, I'm going to go out on a limb and say that most teenagers working pizza delivery don't have the kind of money to pay big ransoms. People working pizza delivery jobs to scrape by aren't generally born with silver spoons in their mouths either. so I question how they figured the family was going to pay $50,000 in 1982. Anyway, I think the whole ransom story is, in essence, just a cover for the much darker reason these two men were specifically targeting a young woman. 20 minutes of highway was all that stood between Anne Harmeyer and the campus where the rest of her life was waiting. Her car never finished the trip, and somewhere on a stretch of road she knew well, she got into a vehicle that wasn't hers and disappeared. 5 weeks later, a farmer picking corn found what remained of her body dumped out in his field. Nearly half a century since, no one has ever been charged, and whoever did this may still be out there, running out the clock before justice catches up with him. Anne grew up in Cambridge City, a small town in eastern Indiana close to the Ohio line. She was an only child, and her father, a local attorney, passed away when Anne was just 4 years old. This left her to be raised by her mother, Marjorie, a music teacher who taught in the local schools and gave piano and voice lessons on the side. By the autumn of 1977, Anne was 20 and heading into her junior year at Indiana University in Bloomington. Both of her parents had studied there, so she'd grown up coming down for games and walking those quads long before she ever enrolled. She'd chosen theater, and by every account she'd flourished in it. That September, Anne had come back to Cambridge City for the weekend to visit a friend who was in the hospital. She'd meant to drive back to Bloomington on Sunday night, but Marjorie didn't like the idea of her daughter on the highway after dark. She talked Anne into waiting until Monday morning instead, figuring the daylight would be safer. So on the morning of Monday, September 12th, 1977, Anne set out in her rust-colored 1971 Pontiac Le Mans, a muscular two-door she was fond of. Bloomington was roughly a 2-hour drive, and she had a 10:30 class she didn't intend to miss, but she never got there. Her route took her onto State Road 37, the highway linking Indianapolis and Bloomington, a road she knew well. The car, though, was struggling, and she stopped at more than one gas station along the way to have someone look it over. The last of those stops came only about 10 miles from where the vehicle finally gave out. Investigators would later track down the people who'd seen her that morning, and every one of them checked out. The Pontiac came to rest on the shoulder of State Road 37, about 2 miles north of Martinsville and only 20 minutes shy of campus. When it was found, the doors were locked, the hazard lights were blinking, and the car was pointed south, toward Bloomington. The radiator had run dry and the engine had overheated, the result of a faulty thermostat. Anne's laundry, her books, and most of her belongings were still sitting inside. Despite this being the 1970s, the alarm went up quickly, because Anne simply wasn't the type to vanish. She was diligent to a fault, and rarely missed a class, so when her 10:30 seat sat empty, people noticed right away. She also hadn't called her mother to say she'd arrived, the way she'd promised, which was completely out of character for her. Later that day, she failed to turn up for a theater rehearsal, and her castmates found that strange as well, though nobody reported her missing at the time. Marjorie, meanwhile, had been phoning her daughter's off-campus apartment over and over with no answer. Near midnight, she and a friend got in a car and retraced the route to Bloomington themselves. That's how they came across the locked, abandoned Pontiac on the side of the highway. They drove to the nearest police station and reported that something had gone badly wrong. What followed was one of the largest searches the area had ever seen, and the cops used an innovative strategy to try to drum up eyewitness accounts. The Indiana State Police and the Morgan County Sheriff's Department threw real weight behind it, with as many as 7 officers working the case full-time at its peak. At one point, they hauled Anne's car back out to the highway where it was found and ran a rolling road check. They flagged down drivers to ask whether they'd passed that vehicle a week earlier or seen anyone near it. Unfortunately, despite this effort, no new tips or evidence came from this attempt. Back in Cambridge City, the town organized itself, holding regular meetings to figure out how to keep Anne's name in front of people. At the time, without our current technology, that meant flyers, printed and posted up and down State Road 37 and across central Indiana. This effort led to the story climbing all the way to the national news. Marjorie made a public appeal that few who saw it ever forgot, begging whoever knew anything to tell her where her daughter was, alive or otherwise. The answer, when it came, was the one no parent wants. On October 18th, 1977, 36 days after Anne went missing, a farmer was picking corn in a field, roughly 7 miles northeast of Martinsville, when he found her body. The spot was about 200 yards off a county road, hidden in corn that stood more than 7 feet tall. The cornfield lay only a few miles from where her car had failed, so wherever she'd been taken, she hadn't been carried far. From the beginning, there was little doubt it was Anne in that field. She was still wearing an Indiana University t-shirt, and she was identified through her clothing, her dental records, and a purse found nearby. The scene told an ugly story, and one of her own shoelaces had been used to bind her hands behind her back, and the other had been used as a ligature. Despite finding her body, this didn't lead to any new breaks in the case, and the case ended up sitting on the shelf, cold. For a long time, Anne's own family believed the case had actually effectively been solved. The understanding that filtered down to relatives was that the man responsible had been caught and fried, and the name attached to that belief was Stephen Judy. Stephen Judy was put to death in Indiana's electric chair in March 1981 for the 1979 annihilation of an entire 4-person family. Before his execution, Judy spoke openly about other crimes and confessed to several more, some in other states. When he was asked about Anne, though, he said flatly that he'd had nothing to do with her and didn't even know who she was. Police at the time didn't buy it, but as it turns out, the denial seems to hold up, and this sick puppy may actually have been telling the truth. A later review by the cold case detectives on file placed Stephen Judy likely in the Marion County Jail on September 12, 1977, the very day Anne disappeared. Unfortunately, the specific jail records have since been lost or thrown out, which complicates things. However, by putting together the court records, they were able to determine that he was likely in lockup since that spring. Given that the jail records are gone, not everyone is entirely satisfied Stephen Judy didn't do it. However, this was a man who clearly wanted to take credit for as much suffering as possible, and despite that, he didn't admit to doing it. Personally, I believe that he's not responsible for the crimes against Anne, based on both his denial and the evidentiary record. That said, I do admit that there's always a possibility that he figured he could inflict more suffering on the family by maintaining a denial when he actually did it. Decades on, it was a news story that pulled Anne's case out of the back of a filing cabinet when her cousin approached investigators with a new technique that could solve the case. In 2018, the arrest of the Golden State Killer in California, cracked open by genetic genealogy, made him wonder why his cousin's case couldn't be next. He filed a Freedom of Information request for Anne's cold case file, but was turned down, since the investigation is still ongoing and active. The police have been tight-lipped about what they have, but there is at least genetic evidence that was recovered from the scene. It's been tested more than once, but as of yet, this evidence doesn't yet appear to have been sent for genetic genealogy testing. Personally, I think we've really got to get on funding genetic genealogy tests for all cases such as this. At the end of the day, every year that passes makes it more unlikely that the perpetrator will ever face justice for his crimes. 45 minutes after the President of the United States was shot in front of hundreds of witnesses, a patrol officer in a quiet corner of Dallas slowed his cruiser. He was pulling up beside a lone man walking along a residential street, and nobody can say for certain what made him stop. Nobody knows exactly what passed between them through the open window of that police car. What we do know is that within a minute, the officer was lying in the road with 4 bullets in him, and the attacker was already walking away. The officer's name was J.D. Tippit, and for more than 60 years he's been remembered, when he's remembered at all, as a footnote to a far larger crime. Tippit was born in September 1924 near Anona in Red River County, the eldest of 7 children in a farming family of modest means. In an odd footnote, he was simply just named J.D., and the initials didn't actually stand for anything at all. He grew up on the land, was raised in the Baptist church, and left public school after the 10th grade, a fairly unremarkable upbringing at the time. When he was 15, the family moved to a stretch of dirt road southwest of Clarksville, and that part of the world stayed in him for the rest of his life. He entered the Army in the summer of 1944 and volunteered to be a paratrooper, which indicates an incredible amount of bravery and a strong martial spirit. By early 1945, he was in Europe, attached to a parachute infantry regiment in the 17th Airborne Division, a unit that had seen heavy action in the Battle of the Bulge. He jumped into combat during the airborne crossing of the Rhine that March, one of the largest operations of its kind ever attempted, and he came home with a Bronze Star. He stayed in uniform until the middle of 1946 before being honorably discharged. Back in Texas, he married Marie Frances Gassaway just after Christmas that year, and the 2 of them went on to raise 3 children. For a while, he tried his hand at cotton farming, but it didn't pay, and in 1952 he traded the fields for a badge and joined the Dallas Police Department. He spent the next 11 years patrolling Oak Cliff, a working-class residential district south of the river. The pay wasn't much, so he picked up part-time work on the side, cooking at a barbecue restaurant on weekend nights and helping out at a neighborhood theater on Sundays. By the autumn of 1963, he was 39 years old, a dependable beat cop with a family and 2 extra jobs. Nobody outside his neighborhood had any reason to know him, that is, until his whole life would intersect with the forces of history. At noon on the 22nd of November 1963, 3 shots rang out across Dealey Plaza, and President Kennedy slumped in the back of his open limousine. Within minutes, the Dallas police radio became a wall of noise, every available unit being pulled toward the center of the city to seal it off. Tippit was working his usual beat that day, in South Oak Cliff, several miles from the chaos that was rapidly unfolding. He knew the district about as well as a man can know a place after 11 years of driving its streets. At about 1:15, the dispatcher ordered him to move into the central part of the area as the department tried to throw a net around downtown. He acknowledged the order, and a few minutes later radioed in to confirm he'd repositioned as instructed. By then, a description of the suspect had started going out over the air. It was vague, the kind of thing that could fit thousands of men in the area. A slender white male in his early 30s, somewhere around 5'10", weighing about 165 pounds. The man who'd soon cross his path was younger, shorter, and lighter than that, but in the rush of a city in panic, the description may have been close enough to put a careful officer on edge. Tippit never radioed in to report that he was approaching the unknown man, so his intent in the approach remains unknown. About 1:30, Tippit was rolling slowly eastward along East 10th Street, about 100 feet past its intersection with Patton Avenue. This was a residential stretch lined with fairly modest houses and parked cars along the street. A man was walking on the sidewalk, and something about him evidently caught the officer's attention. Tippit pulled the cruiser over alongside him. Why he singled out that particular man, on that particular block, remains an unsolved mystery. The man walked over to the passenger side of the car and leaned toward the open vent window, and the two of them exchanged a few words. Whatever was said, it was brief. Tippett opened his door and stepped out, and he began to walk around toward the front of the patrol car. He never made it. The man drew a revolver and started wildly blasting, firing off numerous shots in quick succession. 3 rounds landed square in Tippett's chest, and as he went down, a final shot caught him in the right side of the head. An ambulance carried his body the short distance to Methodist Hospital, where a physician formally pronounced him deceased at around 1:15. There were a remarkable number of people nearby, and roughly a dozen of them ended up named in the official record. The closest was a man in a pickup truck driving the other way. He saw the officer standing by his car and the second man on the far side, heard the shots, and watched Tippett drop. He stayed low in his truck until the attacker had gone, then a little longer, before he worked up the nerve to climb out. In the era before cell phones or even universally available home phones, he tried to call it in on the cruiser's radio and couldn't make it work. Another passerby managed to get through to the dispatcher, and the first word of the shooting reached headquarters only a few minutes after it happened. A used car salesman and former Marine who worked nearby saw the attacker moving off with the revolver still raised and shouted at him, getting only a muttered, unintelligible reply. A woman who'd been standing across the street watched the whole thing and picked the suspect out of a police lineup that very evening. Her account would later be picked apart by critics who found her an unreliable witness who couldn't keep her own narrative straight. However, with so many other witnesses, this was less of an impediment to the investigation than it may usually have been. 2 women who were sisters-in-law, known to history as the Davises, inside a house at the corner, heard the shots and saw the man cut across their lawn. The shooter had flipped open the cylinder of his revolver and dumped the spent casings as he moved. They later found 2 of the casings in the grass and handed them to police, creating a minor chain of custody issue on this evidence. A cab driver parked close by watched the man pass within a few feet of him, weapon in hand, grumbling something under his breath. By the end of that night, 5 separate witnesses had identified the same man in police lineups. 1 more did so the following day, 3 others later picked him out from a photograph, and 2 said only that he resembled the man they'd seen. The shells in the Davises' yard, and 2 more recovered at the scene, would become the most important physical evidence in the case against the man who'd fired them. The attacker didn't get far, and a few blocks away, the manager of a shoe shop noticed a man behaving oddly in his doorway, ducking out of sight as patrol cars went screaming past. The man then slipped into the nearby Texas Theater without bothering to buy a ticket, apparently attempting to hide among the patrons or turn it into a siege situation. The shoe shop manager pointed it out, the theater's cashier flagged the cops, and within minutes officers were converging on the theater and turning up the house lights. It was about 10 minutes to 2 when they moved in and prepared to apprehend the man who had gunned down Tippett. There was a brief scuffle among the seats, and the man tried to get some shots off, but the suspect was wrestled into custody and hauled out to a waiting car as a small crowd jeered. The man was Lee Harvey Oswald, and by that point, he was wanted for far more than a traffic stop gone horribly wrong. Late that evening, he was formally charged with the killing of Officer Tippett, and in the early hours of the following morning, he was charged with assassinating the president as well. He denied both to the end, insisting he was a patsy, that someone else had done it all, and that despite how things looked, he was innocent. The case against Oswald for the officer's death rested heavily on what was found in the street and what was found on his person when he was clapped in cuffs. The weapon was a snub-nosed Smith & Wesson revolver, taken from him during the struggle in the theater. He'd bought it months earlier by mail order under a false name, the same alias he'd used to buy the rifle that would be tied to the president's death. At the scene, and in the Davises' yard, 4 spent cartridge cases were recovered. When the firearms experts examined them, they were unanimous on one point. Those 4 cases had been fired in Oswald's revolver and in no other weapon on Earth. The bullets pulled from Tippett's body were a murkier matter, since Oswald had modified the weapon. It had been altered to chamber a slightly different cartridge than its barrel was built for, so the bullets passed through undersized and erratic, picking up inconsistent markings each time. Some have claimed that the issue with the bullets indicates that there may have been a second shooter, or that Oswald wasn't involved at all. Some theorists have even claimed that there were witnesses that claimed to have seen 2 men running from the scene, but that the police disregarded these witness statements. In the end, though, the evidence generally does point to Oswald being the one who attacked Officer Tippett. For me, the real unsolved mystery here isn't who shot Tippett, or even why, but rather, why Tippett decided to investigate Oswald at all. Maybe the loose description was enough to make him a suspect, but the description really didn't fit Oswald all that well. Oswald had just turned 24, and was substantially lighter than the description that was sent out. It's possible that Tippett hadn't been seeking to apprehend Oswald at all, but that Oswald simply misunderstood what was going on during a routine stop. It's entirely possible that Tippett had just intended to ask Oswald if he had seen anyone who fit the description of the shooter. Personally, I like this idea, because I find it hard to believe that Tippett wouldn't have immediately radioed in if he believed he had JFK's assassin in his sights. In the end, we'll never have a firm answer to Tippett's thoughts in those moments, because of course Tippett didn't make it, and what happened to Oswald next would change everything. Oswald, as you're probably aware, never stood trial for any of it, not for Tippett, and not for President Kennedy. 2 days after the shooting, while being moved from one jail to another in the basement of police headquarters, he was gunned down on live television. The man that did it was a local nightclub owner named Jack Ruby, and the attack was broadcast in front of a national audience. Whatever Oswald knew about his interactions with Officer Tippett that fateful day went into the grave with him. The investigation fell instead to a federal commission, which spent the better part of a year on it before concluding in the autumn of 1964 that Oswald had acted alone in both deaths. A later congressional inquiry in the 1970s reached the same verdict on the officer specifically, citing the gun in his hands and the wall of witnesses who'd put him at the scene. For the family, the grief was swallowed up by the enormity of what had happened that weekend. He'd left behind Marie and the 3 children they'd raised together. Both RFK and the new president telephoned the officer's widow to offer their condolences, and the former First Lady wrote her a letter about the bond they now shared. Money poured in from across the country, hundreds of thousands of dollars from ordinary people who'd read about her in the papers. In the end, we will never know why Tippett decided to approach Oswald, or why Oswald chose additional senseless violence on one of the most tragic days in American history. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here with my somewhat annoying reminder to hit the subscription button and notification bell and turn on all those notifications. Also, don't forget to check out the membership or the Patreon if you want to take your support for my channel to the next level. Somewhere in England, a man with access to the Royal Mail's most sensitive paperwork worked out a single valuable fact: which night a particular train would be hauling more cash than any train in British history. He passed that fact to a gang of thieves, took his cut, and then disappeared so effectively that more than 60 years later, nobody can prove who he was. The robbery he set in motion became the most famous heist the country has ever seen, and he never spent a day behind bars for it. The gang knew him only as the Ulsterman, and he's the first mystery in this case, and far from the last. The train at the center of it was a traveling post office, a rolling sorting room railwaymen called the Up Special. At 10 to 7 on the evening of the 7th of August 1963, it pulled out of Glasgow Central bound for Euston in London, due to arrive just after 4 the next morning. 12 carriages, hauled by a diesel locomotive, carried 72 post office staff who sorted mail through the night as the country slept around them. The second carriage behind the engine was the one that mattered, since it had the high-value bundles of banknotes moving south between bank branches. On an ordinary night, it might hold around 300,000 pounds, still a staggering sum at the time. But this wasn't an ordinary night, and the August bank holiday had just passed. Scottish banks were flushing days of accumulated cash down to London, so the coach was loaded with somewhere between 2.5 and 3 million pounds. The post office owned high-value coaches fitted with alarms, barred windows, and reinforced locks, built so a night like this couldn't happen, but those coaches were out of service. In their place ran an ordinary reserve carriage with no alarm and no bars on the windows. The richest train in the country was, that night, also one of the softest. The mastermind was Bruce Reynolds, a Londoner who drifted from petty break-ins into serious robbery and fancied himself built for adventure. Around him stood the core of what's sometimes called the Southwest Gang. Reynolds himself, Gordon Goody, Buster Edwards, and Charlie Wilson. They were accomplished thieves, but they'd never stopped a train in their lives, and they knew it. So they brought in specialists to assist them in their efforts. A second outfit, the South Coast Raiders, had real experience robbing trains, and from them came Tommy Wisby, Bob Welch, and Jim Hussey, along with Roger Corddry. This last man could rig a railway signal to stop a train wherever he liked, so he was an invaluable asset to this train heist. The final crew ran to roughly 16 men on the ground directly involved in the great train robbery. One was a South London carpenter named Ronnie Biggs, whose name the world would remember above all the others, even though his job was almost trivial. Biggs was supposed to supply one thing: a retired driver who could move the locomotive once it was seized, and let's just say he failed miserably, but more on that in a moment. And then there was the inside man, who played perhaps the most important role of all. The whole scheme rested on knowing how much money the train carried and when, and that came from someone deep inside the postal system. The gang never learned his real name, but because of his accent, or perhaps something else, they called him the Ulsterman, meaning he was from Northern Ireland. Just after 3 in the morning on the 8th of August, the train rolled toward a quiet spot called Sears Crossing. This location was in Buckinghamshire between Leighton Buzzard and Cheddington, and Corddry had done his work. He'd covered the green signal with a glove and wired a battery to light the red lamp, so the driver saw a red stop signal the railway had never set. The driver was Jack Mills, 58 years old, a man with decades on the rails, who probably thought he had seen everything the job had to offer. He brought the train to a halt exactly as the false signal told him to, and his second man, 26-year-old David Whitby, climbed out of the train to investigate. Before he could make sense of what he was seeing, Whitby was overwhelmed and restrained by a couple of goons. Hooded men were already swarming up into the cab from both sides of the train. Mills grappled with one of them and was struck from behind by another, a blow to the head that left him bleeding and barely conscious. Then the plan nearly fell apart. The retired driver Biggs had brought along couldn't operate this newer locomotive. His experience was with older engines, and the controls in front of him might as well have come from another machine. There was no time to argue, and the gang dragged the injured Mills back to his controls and made him drive the train half a mile down the line to Bridego Bridge. There, the plotters had placed a white sheet stretched between two poles to mark the spot to stop. At the bridge, the gang had already uncoupled the engine and the high-value coach from the rest of the train, leaving the sorters further back with no idea what was happening up front. The handful of postal staff inside, led by a man named Frank Dewhurst, tried briefly to hold the door, but was overwhelmed. After that, there was nothing they could do. They were ordered to lie face down in the corner, and Mills and Whitby were handcuffed together and laid down beside them. What followed was almost industrial. The robbers formed a human chain and passed the mailbags out of the coach and down the embankment to a waiting truck. They cleared 120 of the 128 sacks in 15 to 20 minutes, leaving the rest only because time had run out. The haul of cash weighed around 2.5 tons. Within about 30 minutes of the train stopping, the entire convoy was gone, and to fool any witness who saw them, 2 of their getaway trucks carried the very same number plate. As they ran the back roads with a radio tuned to the police frequency, they heard the first stunned report that the train itself had been robbed. 27 miles from the bridge sat Leatherslade Farm, a rundown place the plotters had purchased 2 months previous. It was almost the perfect location, but for the fact that there were other rural folk around who may notice unusual activity at the farm. Inside, they tipped out the sacks and counted their ill-gotten gains. They had stolen around 2.5 million pounds in just 30 minutes. Divided between the men and their informants, it came to roughly 150,000 pounds a share, a colossal fortune in 1963. To pass the time while the heat died down, they played Monopoly, and they used real notes from the heist to do it, perhaps to raise the stakes of the game. In a somewhat bizarre twist, that game of Monopoly would help send most of them to prison for years. Their immediate undoing, though, was a single careless sentence spoken by one of the robbers. He told the postal workers not to move for half an hour to give the crew time to escape. Investigators turned that inadvertent clue into a circle on the map, a 30-mile radius, a half-hour drive in a fast car, and Leatherslade Farm sat inside that circle. The cops, of course, had no reason to suspect the farm itself yet, but the men weren't about to take any additional chances. Listening to the radio, the gang realized the police would be combing this exact patch of countryside, so they moved up their departure and scattered. A man hired to come back and burn the farm clean of all evidence lost his nerve and ran, and the farmhouse and everything inside it was left standing. The break came from a herdsman in a neighboring field who thought the activity at the supposedly empty farm was worth a phone call. On the 13th of August, 5 days after the robbery, 2 officers walked up to Leatherslade and found a thieves' paradise of evidence. They found trucks, sleeping bags, food, sacks stamped by the post office, banknote wrappers, and a Monopoly board. The gang had wiped the place down, but they'd missed things, and surviving fingerprints turned up on that Monopoly set, which they hadn't bothered to clean in their haste. The farm wasn't the only gift the gang handed the police. Days later, hikers nearby found briefcases stuffed with crisp banknotes, more than 100,000 pounds dumped among the trees. Tucked in with the cash was a German hotel receipt made out to Brian Field, one of the conspirators, and his wife. He was a clerk for a lawyer, and it was the thread that tied the apparently respectable man to the men who'd taken the train. By now, Scotland Yard had taken over the London end of the case under Detective Chief Superintendent Tommy Butler, a relentless, secretive man nicknamed the Grey Fox. He lived for the job and trusted no one with the full picture, not even his own squad. With fingerprints from the farm and a steady drip of inside information from informants, the names came together, and through the fall, the gang were arrested one after another. The trial opened in Aylesbury on the 20th of January 1964 and ran for 51 days, with hundreds of exhibits and witnesses in a courtroom modified to hold them all. Not every charge stuck, and one of the men walked free partway through the proceedings. His only link to the crime was his prints on that Monopoly set, and his counsel argued he'd played the game with his brother-in-law, who was involved well before the robbery. For the rest, the reckoning was severe, and in April, the judge condemned the robbery as an act of cold greed and violence. 7 of the men were handed 30 years apiece, sentences longer than many got for taking a life. That sentence makes more sense when you realize that Jack Mills, the lead train conductor, spent the rest of his life partially disabled due to the blow to his head. I have to imagine that without that senseless act of violence, the sentences may not have been so severe. There's also the fact that the majority of the money wasn't returned, and as such, these long sentences really enforce that this wasn't a paid holiday for criminals. For some of the men, 30 years was simply not a sentence they intended to serve. In August 1964, one of the men, Charlie Wilson, was broken out of Winson Green Prison in Birmingham by a 3-man team who got in and out in under 3 minutes. 11 months later, Ronnie Biggs, the one who almost screwed up the entire operation by failing to get a qualified train conductor, also escaped. He went over the wall of Wandsworth Prison with a rope ladder and into a van that was waiting for him. He then had plastic surgery in Paris, then ran to Australia, then Rio de Janeiro, where the British authorities couldn't touch him. Biggs lived in the open in Brazil for decades and only came home, old and ill, in 2001. Charlie Wilson, for his part, surfaced in Canada under a borrowed name, living a comfortable suburban life outside Montreal, joining a golf club and blending in. He stayed free until a careless invitation to a relative back home led Scotland Yard to his door, and he was recaptured in 1968. He served the rest of his sentence and was released, after which he moved to Spain, where he was gunned down in 1990. Years later, in 2014, one of the participants, a man named Gordon Goody, finally offered a name for the Ulsterman, who was never caught. He claimed this mysterious figure had been a postal worker called Patrick McKenna, then 43 years old. He was a quiet family man from Salford who'd been born in Belfast, and Goody only ever learned it by catching sight of his name written inside a glasses case. By the time anyone went looking, McKenna was long dead, and he'd died with no criminal record and very little money to his name. Plenty of people doubt that McKenna was involved at all, and instead point to an alternative figure named Sammy Osterman. Not much is known about him beyond the fact that he was on the periphery of the heist crew and was never charged. Some believe that the nickname, the Ulsterman, was actually based on a mishearing of the name Osterman, though this remains unknown. And honestly, I think that sounds like a fairly realistic interpretation, given how similar the two words sound. After all, I suspect that in England, you're more likely to hear that someone is an Ulsterman than someone has the last name Osterman. There is, of course, one remaining mystery from this heist. The bulk of that £2.5 million was never recovered. The ultimate whereabouts of the majority of the money will likely never be known.